The wind moved gently through the empty alleys of New York, brushing against brick walls and rattling the occasional loose sign. The city, known for its noise and motion, had settled into a rare hush. Streetlights painted soft amber halos on the pavement. Cars were parked, windows drawn, and the sky above was clear, sprinkled with quiet stars. On the edge of a rooftop, high above it all, sat Peter Parker. The Spider-Man suit rested beside him, folded neatly. He held a warm cup of cocoa in gloved hands, steam rising and curling into the cool night air. There was no rush tonight. There were no alarms, screams, or disasters, just stillness. He took a long breath, his shoulders finally lowering after days of tension. For once it felt like maybe the city didn't need him, at least not right now. A gentle peace settled in his chest, rare and welcome. He looked out over the rooftops, watching. New York breathed. Then a soft vibration buzzed at his wrist. He glanced down at the small, Stark-made communicator tucked under his sleeve. It's not an emergency alert. Just a message. Short. Quiet. I can't sleep. Can you please come? Zoe, Houston. He read it twice. It wasn't marked urgent. It wasn't dramatic. There were no cries for help or mentions of danger. Just a few honest words from a kid in another city. His fingers curled loosely around the cup as he stared at the message, his mind slowly drifting away from New York's calm glow, toward a little girl somewhere far away, staring into the dark. He didn't know her, and she didn't expect him to answer. But something about that message stayed with him. Peaceful night or not, something wasn't finished. Peter leaned back, balancing easily on the rooftop's edge, legs swinging slightly over the quiet city below. The cocoa was gone now, the cup resting beside his mask, both catching a soft gleam from the moonlight. It had been a long day. Not complex, not chaotic, just full. It was the kind of day that didn't make headlines but still left him tired in the best way. Earlier, he'd helped an older man find his way back to his parked car downtown. Then there was the runaway puppy that had managed to wedge itself between a fence and a recycling bin in Queens. A kid in Harlem lost his science project on the subway. Peter had tracked it down before the final stop. Nothing world-saving. But somehow, it all mattered. Small things always did. He swung for a while after sunset, not because he had to, but because the air felt good, and the silence above the streets let him think. No sirens, no sudden crashes, just the smooth rhythm of his web shooters and the weightless drift from one building to the next. As he neared home, he pulled off his mask, letting the wind hit his face. The city smelled like rain was coming, but not yet. He touched down on a low rise near his apartment, landing quietly, knees bending just enough to absorb the motion. His shadow stretched out beside him, long and familiar. He sat again momentarily before going inside, glancing at the skyline. That message still lingered in his mind. I can't sleep, can you please come? A few words typed by small fingers were sent from 1,000 miles away. Peter didn't move right away. The city felt calm, but inside, something was pulling at him. It was not like a mission. It was more like a promise he hadn't made but still needed to keep. In a small apartment on the quiet edge of Houston, Zoe lay wide-eyed in her bed. The hallway light poured a soft line across the floor, barely reaching the foot of her blanket. Her room was filled with everything a child might want to feel safe. Stuffed animals, glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, a pink nightlight shaped like a butterfly. But tonight, none of it worked. The shadows felt different. Not scary exactly, just big. They moved when the wind rustled the tree outside. They shifted when her ceiling fan spun too fast. Every tiny sound, the tick of the clock, the creak of the wooden floor, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room, felt louder in the stillness. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even sure she was scared. But her chest felt tight, like something invisible was on it. Her mom kissed her forehead before leaving for work and promised to return before sunrise. Zoe understood. Her mom worked hard and kept them safe, but knowing that didn't make the house feel less empty at night. It didn't stop her from staring at the ceiling, waiting for her eyes to get heavy, wishing the dark didn't feel so endless. She turned on her side and stared at the window. No city skyline here, just the tops of trees and the quiet glow of other apartment windows. Somewhere out there, people were sleeping, kids her age, probably dreaming of something funny or exciting. But her dreams felt stuck behind a door she couldn't open. Her tablet sat on the bedside table, still unlocked from the cartoon she'd been watching earlier. Without overthinking, she picked it up and opened the messaging app she'd once used to send a letter to a hero she didn't think would ever read it. The first time, it had been for fun, a digital postcard addressed to Spider-Man. She never got a reply, and she didn't expect one. Heroes had bigger things to deal with, but tonight felt different. She typed slowly, pausing between each word, checking her spelling like her teacher had taught her. I can't sleep. Can you please come? Zoe Houston. She hit send and stared at the screen for a while, not expecting it to do anything. Maybe she just needed to say it out loud to someone, even if no one was listening. She put the tablet back down, pulled her blanket to her chin, and tried to convince herself to close her eyes. But they wouldn't stay shut. The quiet didn't feel calm. It felt heavy. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she whispered to the dark, "Please, just one word, not loud, not desperate, it's just a quiet hope." Peter sat on the edge of his bed, suit still off, fingers hovering above the screen of his communicator. The message sat open, unchanged. It was just one sentence, no emojis, panic, or urgency. And yet, it said more than most emergencies ever did. Over the years, he had seen thousands of messages, calls for help, distress signals, news alerts. But this one didn't feel like any of those. It didn't even feel like a call for Spider-Man. It felt like a whisper, soft and honest, meant for anyone who might understand what it's like to lie awake and feel like the night might never end. Peter knew he didn't owe her anything. Houston had its heroes. He wasn't even sure how she found the right channel to reach him, but it didn't matter. He kept thinking about the message over and over, not the words, but the tone. A child, alone in a quiet room, just asking someone to show up. He glanced out the window. New York was still calm. The streets below were resting. No movement, no danger. If there was ever a time to step away for a night, this was it. He stood slowly, reaching for the suit, familiar fabric in his hands. As he pulled it on, he didn't rush. There was no adrenaline this time, no alarm bells or countdowns. It was just a quiet decision to be there for someone who didn't expect it, but needed it. Stark Tech had a silent flight protocol, something Tony had set up for emergencies or moments like this. There was no noise, no announcement, just a fast, invisible way to get where he needed to go. Peter tapped a few commands into his device and quietly stepped out into the night, the wind catching the edge of his mask. As he launched into the sky, rising higher than the rooftops of New York, one thought settled in his chest. Sometimes being a hero wasn't about the big stuff. Sometimes it was just about listening. Peter sat on the edge of his bed, suit still off, fingers hovering above the screen of his communicator. The message sat open, unchanged. It was just one sentence. No emojis, panic, or urgency. And yet, it said more than most emergencies ever did. Over the years, he had seen thousands of messages, calls for help, distress signals, news alerts. But this one didn't feel like any of those. It didn't even feel like a call for Spider-Man. It felt like a whisper, soft and honest, meant for anyone who might understand what it's like to lie awake and feel like the night might never end. Peter knew he didn't owe her anything. Houston had its heroes. He wasn't even sure how she found the right channel to reach him, but it didn't matter. He kept thinking about the message over and over, not the words, but the tone. A child, alone in a quiet room, just asking someone to show up. He glanced out the window. New York was still calm. The streets below were resting. No movement, no danger. If there was ever a time to step away for a night, this was it. He stood slowly, reaching for the suit, familiar fabric in his hands. As he pulled it on, he didn't rush. There was no adrenaline this time, no alarm bells or countdowns. It was just a quiet decision to be there for someone who didn't expect it, but needed it. Stark Tech had a silent flight protocol, something Tony had set up for emergencies or moments like this. There was no noise, no announcement, just a fast, invisible way to get where he needed to go. Peter tapped a few commands into his device and quietly stepped out into the night, the wind catching the edge of his mask. As he launched into the sky, rising higher than the rooftops of New York, one thought settled in his chest. Sometimes being a hero wasn't about the big stuff. Sometimes it was just about listening. Spider-Man stayed kneeling beside her bed, not in a rush, not checking his watch, not looking over his shoulder like he had somewhere else to be. Just there. Steady. Present. Zoe shifted slightly under the blanket, glancing up at him. The room still had shadows in the corners. The quiet was still there, but it didn't feel as sharp anymore. Still, the weight on her chest hadn't entirely gone. "I don't know why I feel like this," she admitted, eyes flicking between the wall and his mask. "It's not like anything bad happened. I feel weird." Spider-Man tilted his head. "You know," he said gently, "there were a lot of nights when I was your age that I couldn't sleep either. My room would feel too quiet, the air too still, and I'd lie there with my mind spinning." Zoe looked at him, surprised. "Really? But you're you." "I wasn't always me," he said. "I was just a kid with a too small bed, a too busy head, and a window that made the world outside look way bigger than I felt." She let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, more like a soft release of something she'd been holding. "Sometimes," he continued, "our thoughts get louder when the world goes quiet. Everything we didn't think about during the day comes knocking at once. Little things, big things, questions we don't know the answers to." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes I wonder if my mom ever gets scared when she's working, or if she's tired but doesn't say, or if she misses me while I'm sleeping." Peter's chest ached a little at that. "I'd bet she thinks about you all the time. And yes, she probably gets scared, but she's strong just like you. Being strong doesn't mean never feeling scared, it means doing your best anyway." He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "You know, shadows aren't bad. They're just places where light hasn't landed yet. They move because light moves. They're not trying to scare us. They don't know what shape to be in." Zoe blinked. "So they're confused?" In a way, he smiled under the mask. "Kind of like us sometimes. The trick is not to fight them, but to understand they're part of the room too. They can't hurt you. They're not real in the way you are." She turned toward the corner of the room where one shadow had bothered her earlier. It wasn't doing anything now, just sitting like a sleepy dog. "What if I still feel weird tomorrow night?" she asked. "Then you feel weird," he said. "It's okay. You don't have to feel okay every night. But you can remind yourself that feeling small doesn't mean you are small. You're loved, you're seen, and you're stronger than the dark." Zoe pulled her blanket up slightly, her fingers fiddling with the edge. "I think maybe I just needed someone to say that." Spider-Man nodded. "We all need that sometimes." She looked over at him again. "Do you still feel small sometimes?" He chuckled softly. "All the time. But talking like this helps. Even heroes need to be reminded they matter." There was a quiet beat, the kind of silence that didn't feel lonely, but complete. Zoe yawned without meaning to. She blinked slowly, her body settling now that her mind had been heard. "You're good at this," she mumbled. "At what?" "Making the dark feel smaller." He looked at her with the softness of someone who understood what that meant. "Thanks. That might be my favorite kind of hero work." Spider-Man looked around Zoe's room, eyes scanning the shelves of books, the drawings taped to the walls, and the stuffed animals lined up like tiny soldiers across the foot of her bed. He could see she was more relaxed now. Her shoulders weren't so tight, her breathing was slower, but there was still a bit of restlessness in her eyes. She wasn't ready to fall asleep just yet. "You ever play shadow games?" he asked, glancing toward the lamp on her nightstand. Zoe tilted, her head. "Like making shapes on the wall?" He nodded. "Exactly, but not just any shapes. You gotta give them voices and stories. It's the only way they behave." She giggled just a little, and that was all the encouragement he needed. He turned the lamp slightly so the light cast long shadows across the wall beside her bed. Then he raised his hands, moving his fingers with precision. The first shape was a rabbit, its ears twitching, its nose bouncing. "This is Sir Hops-a-Lot, Spider-Man," said in a cartoonishly serious voice. "Guardian of all bedtime snacks, protector of half-eaten cookies." Zoe laughed, covering her mouth. "He looks like he lost a fight with a marshmallow." "True," Spider-Man nodded. "But never underestimate the Marshmallow Knights." Shifted his hands again, and the rabbit morphed into what looked like a giant bird with floppy wings. He made it wobble across the wall, making sound effects with his mouth. "This is Flappy the Brave. He once got stuck in a ceiling fan but came out stronger." Zoe burst into laughter, which came from somewhere deep in her belly. "That's not even a real story. Every bedtime needs a little nonsense," he said with a shrug. "It confuses the shadows, keeps them from getting too serious." She grinned and sat up a little, mimicking his hands in the air, trying to make her shape. Hers looked more like a blob, but she declared, "This is Princess Wiggly, ruler of—" "Lost socks!" Spider-Man gasped. "I've been looking for those socks for years." The two of them went back and forth for a while, creating an oddball cast of characters. One was a sleepy dragon who only snored bubbles, another a detective snail who could only move an inch every 30 minutes. Each shadow had a different voice, mood, and silly little name. With each joke, the room shifted. The corners didn't feel so deep, the dark didn't feel so heavy. The shadows had become part of the fun, not something to be afraid of. They danced and stretched across the walls, now shaped with silly stories instead of silent mysteries. After a few more rounds, Zoe leaned back on her pillow, still smiling, eyes beginning to slow. Her hands dropped to her lap. "That was fun," she murmured. Spider-Man gave a slight bow. "Told you, shadows don't stand a chance against imagination." She yawned, long and quiet. "You're not like I imagined." He sat back a bit, resting on one hand. How'd you imagine me? Busy, serious, too important for stuff like this. He tilted his head. Maybe I used to be. But I think this is the most important part of my night. Zoe nodded, eyes now half closed. I'm glad you came. Me too, he said softly. Zoe lay nestled beneath her blanket, its corners pulled snugly around her shoulders like a warm hug. The laughter from their shadow game still lingered in the air, but her body started settling. Her eyelids fluttered a little slower now. The room had softened, the same furniture, the same corners, but everything felt quieter, lighter. Spider-Man stayed close, sitting cross-legged beside the bed, one hand resting gently on the floor. He didn't speak right away. He knew the moment was fragile, and silence had finally turned into something gentle, not tense. Zoe blinked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. Will I ever see you again? Considering the truth, he looked at her for a moment, then gave a small, warm smile. Maybe not like this, but if you ever feel alone, if the shadows start acting up again, close your eyes and remember tonight. I'll be out there, somewhere, listening. She nodded slowly. Like, not magic, but kinda like memory magic? Exactly, he said. Memory magic's real. You carry it with you, even when it feels like you're by yourself. Her fingers played gently with the edge of the blanket. She turned her head toward the window for a second and then returned to him. I don't feel small anymore. He felt something shift in his chest. That's because you're not. You were never small, Zoe. The dark likes to trick people into thinking they are. She yawned, long and soft, and nestled more profoundly into the bed. Her teddy bear sat tucked under one arm now. The air in the room felt still like nighttime should, not heavy, just slow and safe. Spider-Man reached over and gently adjusted the blanket near her shoulder. You've got a big day tomorrow. The world's waiting for you to wake up and reminded how brave you are. Will you still be swinging through New York? She mumbled, eyes nearly closed. Probably, he said with a soft chuckle. But you've got the sky. We'll both be under it. That's our secret link. She didn't answer this time. Her breathing had evened out, quiet and slow. The kind of breathing that meant her body had finally stopped holding itself tight. He sat with her for a bit longer. There was no rush, no alarm. There's no reason to run. The lamp still cast a faint glow on the wall, and the once scary shadows now looked like soft patterns in a dream. The breeze through the window barely moved the curtains anymore. After a few minutes, he stood slowly, careful not to make a sound. One last look at her. Peaceful, still, safe. Her chest rises and falls in rhythm with the kind of sleep that only comes after feeling indeed seen. He moved toward the window, easing it open with care, letting the outside air drift in just a little more. He glanced back once. Zoe didn't stir. She was home, in her room. And finally, she was resting. Spider-Man stepped out into the night, leaving the shadows behind him. The rooftops of Houston stretched out beneath him as Spider-Man stood quietly on the edge of a building not far from Zoe's window. The city was still, just like New York had been. There were no traffic sounds, no shouts, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the hum of streetlights. The air was softer here, like even the night wanted to sleep. He watched the sky for a moment, letting the quiet soak in. The stars above twinkled faintly, and somewhere to the east a faint orange line hinted that morning wasn't far off. He didn't usually stay out this late without web-swinging through alleys or racing to fix something wrong. But tonight had been different. Slower, more human. He thought about Zoe, how small she had looked in that big bed, how heavy her words had sounded for someone so young, and yet she had laughed. She had made shadow puppets. She had told him he made the dark feel smaller. That stuck with him. Sometimes he wondered if the mask helped people feel safe or if it was just a symbol. Tonight it had just been him, sitting beside a child who needed a little company. There were no fights, no flash, no swinging between skyscrapers, just being there. That had been enough. He imagined her now, curled up, deep in sleep, breathing calmly. A little girl who had written a message without real expectation that it would go anywhere, just trying to feel a little less alone. And somehow, across cities, across states, her voice had reached him. Spider-Man breathed in and let the moment settle. His job wasn't always about danger. Sometimes it was about listening for the quietest voices, the ones that didn't scream but whispered. The ones who needed someone, not something. He adjusted the mask on his face, the breeze tugging gently at the fabric of his suit. One last glance in the direction of her apartment. One last thought. Some nights saving the world doesn't mean stopping a train or catching a villain. Some nights it means showing up for one person. Sitting beside a bed, making silly shadows. Reminding someone they matter. The sun was starting to rise now, casting a soft gold glow along the tops of buildings, painting Houston in light. "Good night, Zoe," he whispered into the morning air. "Good night, Houston." And with a soft push from his feet, Spider-Man rose into the sky, soaring quietly between the rooftops. Not as a symbol, not as a savior, but simply as someone who understood what it meant to need comfort, and what it meant to give it.